A few years ago, I worked for a small land surveying company. My job was simple: scan the ground for underground anomalies before construction projects began. It wasn't exciting, but it paid well. One night, I was sent to an abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of town. The city had plans to repurpose the land, but first, they needed to confirm how many bodies were actually buried there. The cemetery had been out of use for decades, and many of the headstones were missing or broken. I wouldn't normally be sent to a place like that so late, but the city didn't want to attract attention. The land was controversial. Some families still had ancestors buried there, and the idea of repurposing it had caused backlash. To avoid protesters or unwanted questions, my company was told to survey the land at night, when no one would be around to see. I didn't like it, but I didn't have a choice. I expected it to be like every other job. I was dead wrong. I arrived just after 10 p.m. The place was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, and the only light came from my truck's headlights in the full moon overhead. The cemetery gates were rusted open, barely hanging on their hinges. The silence was overwhelming. No wind, no distant traffic, just the occasional chirp of a cricket. I grabbed my equipment and got to work. The GPR scanner was a bulky, cart-like device that I had to push across the ground slowly. As I moved along the overgrown paths, the screen displayed underground disturbances, signs of old coffins and burial shifts. Nothing unusual. But then I found something wrong. Near the far end of the cemetery, the scanner picked up a fresh disturbance, soil that had been recently moved. My stomach tightened. There was no record of any recent burials here. I hesitated, then knelt down and ran my hand over the ground. The dirt was loose. Someone had dug here, recently. Then I saw them. Footprints, fresh ones, leading away from the grave I was standing on. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Someone had been here tonight. Maybe they were still here. I swung my flashlight around, scanning the tombstones, the trees beyond the fence, the shadows stretching across the uneven ground. Nothing, just eerie, suffocating stillness. I took a shaky breath. I was probably just being paranoid. Maybe some animal had disturbed the soil. Maybe it was just ground settling. I turned back to my scanner. That's when I heard it. A soft thud, muffled from beneath me. I froze. It was faint, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. It had come from the ground. Then it happened again. A dull, weak knock. Something was inside that grave. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then I heard it, a sound that still makes my skin crawl to this day. A voice, muffled, weak, but unmistakably human. "Help me." I scrambled for my radio with trembling hands and called 911. My voice came out shaky as I explained what I had found. The operator told me to stay put. Help was on the way, but I didn't feel safe standing there. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. That's when I noticed something else. The footprints in the dirt, they weren't walking away from the grave. They were circling it. Over and over, my stomach twisted. Whoever buried this person had been standing here for a long time, watching. And what if they were still here? I turned slowly, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. My truck was about 50 yards away, parked near the broken cemetery gate. The path leading to it was clear. I forced myself to move. I walked, trying to stay calm, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I was halfway to my truck when I heard a rustling sound behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. A shadow moved between the headstones. Someone was out there. I broke into a sprint. I didn't care how crazy I looked, I just ran. My boots pounded against the dirt as I fumbled for my keys in my pocket. I could hear footsteps behind me, fast, getting closer. I reached my truck, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands shook as I jammed the keys into the ignition. The headlights flicked on, and that's when I saw him. A man stood just beyond the beams, half hidden behind a crumbling gravestone. His clothes were dirty, his face gaunt, but what terrified me most were his hands. They were caked in dirt up to his wrists. He had been digging, and he was smiling. I slammed the truck into reverse and peeled out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. When they excavated the grave, they found her. a woman in her late 20s, wrapped in a tarp, barely clinging to life. She had been buried alive. The doctor said if she had been down there much longer, she wouldn't have survived. She was the 10th victim. The police later arrested the man responsible, Charles Whitman, a former gravedigger who had been using the abandoned cemetery as his personal burial ground for years. He confessed to the murders but refused to say how many people he had buried there. He only smiled and said, "I lost count." As for why he killed them, his reasoning was even more disturbing. During his interrogation, Whitman claimed he was helping them move on. In his twisted mind, he believed the women he buried were lost souls who needed to be put underground to find peace. He chose his victims carefully, women who were alone, women who wouldn't be missed right away. He lured them in, murdered them, and buried them beneath unmarked graves, as if erasing them from existence entirely. But the most chilling part, he admitted that sometimes he would wait before covering the grave completely. He liked to listen, to see if any of them were still alive when he left them there. They never found all the bodies. And to this day I wonder, if I hadn't been there that night, if I hadn't heard the knocking, how many more would he have buried? Before we move on to the next story, if you're still here, make sure to subscribe and comment where you're tuning in from for more true stories. Thanks. I was in high school when this happened, about 6 years ago. It was a normal Friday morning. Second period had just started, and I was sitting at my desk, half listening to my teacher while absent-mindedly scrolling through my notes. The classroom was quiet, except for the occasional whispers and the sound of pens scratching against paper. Then, the lockdown alarm went off.
Lockdown, lockdown. This is an emergency alert. Please follow lockdown procedures.
At first, no one reacted much. We had drills all the time, and everyone just assumed it was another one. My teacher sighed and walked to the door to lock it like she always did. But then the intercom clicked on. A voice came through, but something was off. They sounded out of breath, almost panicked. "This is a lockdown. This is not a drill." That sentence changed everything. The room got dead silent. My teacher's expression shifted immediately. She rushed back from the door, turned off the lights, and motioned for us to move away from the windows and hide. There was some confusion at first, people whispering, but the fear set in quickly. We all crouched behind desks and tried to stay quiet. I remember my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone. My first instinct was to text my mom, but before I could type anything, the classroom phone rang. Everyone jumped. My teacher hesitated for a second before answering. She picked up the phone and whispered, "Hello?" We couldn't hear the response, but I saw the color drain from her face. She hung up immediately and whispered, "Stay absolutely silent." That's when we heard the sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were walking like they had all the time in the world. A few of us exchanged nervous glances, but no one said a word. I held my breath, trying to listen. Then the footsteps stopped right outside our door. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The doorknob rattled. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. My teacher held up a hand, signaling for us to stay still. We waited, frozen in place. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. None of us dared to move. I saw my friend Jason, gripping the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles were white. Another girl had tears streaming down her face. Then we heard it, an ear-piercing scream from down the hall. Not a normal scream, a real gut-wrenching scream of pure terror. I will never forget that sound. Then silence. Someone in the room started quietly crying, and my teacher motioned for them to stop. We sat there for what felt like hours, listening. More footsteps, running this time. Then voices, the police. The lockdown was lifted about 15 minutes later, but it felt like forever. An officer came to our door, knocked twice, and called my teacher's name before unlocking it. She opened the door cautiously. The officer told us to line up and walk out quickly. As we stepped into the hallway, I saw things I wish I could unsee. A bloody handprint on the wall, a backpack abandoned in the middle of the floor, and worst of all, the body. A student, someone I recognized, lying face down, completely still. We were rushed outside, past flashing police lights and teachers trying to keep students calm. I found out later that the suspect was a former student who had been expelled the previous year. He had come back with a knife, targeting specific people who he believed had wronged him. The person who screamed, they survived, but the student on the floor didn't. That's where most people think the story ends, but for me it didn't. I had trouble sleeping for months after. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that scream. I'd see the blood on the walls, the body on the ground. But the worst part was something I never told anyone. Something that still keeps me up at night. A week after the incident, there were counselors available. They had us sit in groups and talk about our feelings, but I didn't say much. I just listened. One of the girls from another class mentioned something strange. She said she had been in the bathroom when the lockdown was announced. She hid in one of the stalls, clutching her phone, too scared to even text. But she wasn't alone. Someone else was in there with her. She said she could hear breathing from the stall next to hers. At first, she assumed it was just another student hiding like she was. But then she noticed something. Whoever was in that stall wasn't moving. No shuffling, no shifting, just breathing. And then, a whisper. "You're lucky I'm not supposed to kill you." She said she nearly screamed, but covered her mouth just in time. She stayed completely still, barely even breathing, until she heard the bathroom door open and close. She never saw who it was, and neither did the cops. When they caught the guy, he had been alone. That part of the story never made it to the news. I only know about it because I heard it firsthand. And the scariest part? That girl wasn't even on his list. Whoever he was whispering to in that stall, whoever he meant to kill, they never found out. This happened in 2019 when I had just moved into my first apartment alone. I was 24, living in a small, one-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine. At the time, I worked long hours and often got home late. The building was mostly empty, except for a few older tenants who kept to themselves. I liked that, no noise, no distractions. But looking back, I think that's what made me a target. The first sign that something was wrong was small. I'd come home and find little things out of place. A kitchen cabinet slightly open when I knew I'd closed it. My bathroom light on when I was sure I had turned it off. I brushed it off as me being forgetful. I was working almost 60 hours a week, exhausted all the time. It made sense that I'd slip up. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was my upstairs neighbor, but then I remembered I didn't have an upstairs neighbor. I lived on the top floor. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They creaked against the old wooden beams above me. My heart started pounding as I lay there, frozen. I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling. Maybe a raccoon had gotten into the attic. I forced myself to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next day I mentioned it to my landlord. He waved it off, saying, "There's no attic, just some crawl spaces for wiring. Nothing big enough for anyone to be up there." That should have made me feel better. It didn't. A week later, I came home late, as usual. As I unlocked my door, I felt something off. The air in my apartment felt different because the windows had been shut all day, yet it smelled faintly of sweat and something sour, like unwashed clothes. It was subtle, but enough to make my skin crawl, as if the space had absorbed someone else's presence. I did a quick check. Nothing seemed disturbed, no signs of a break-in. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. Then, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again, soft, shuffling footsteps, directly above me. I grabbed my phone and stood completely still, trying to listen. The sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting. After a minute, I convinced myself I was just imagining things. But then, just as I turned off the lights, I heard something worse. A faint, quiet cough. Right above me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my landlord again, insisting that someone was in the ceiling. He sighed but agreed to come check. When he arrived, he brought a ladder and a flashlight. We went to the hallway, where there was a small access panel in the ceiling. He opened it, shined his light inside, and froze. I will never forget the look on his face. There's stuff up here," he muttered. He backed away and called the police. When they arrived, they climbed up and confirmed what I already knew deep down. Someone had been living above me. They found a thin, filthy sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and worst of all, my missing clothes. A few shirts, socks, even a pair of my shoes. That's when I realized whoever had been up there had been coming down into my apartment. The crawl space connected to a small maintenance hatch in the back of my closet. It wasn't locked. It never even crossed my mind to check. The police didn't find him that day. But later that week, a man was arrested 2 blocks away, breaking into another apartment. He was homeless, in his 50s, and had a long history of squatting in empty spaces. The man was later identified as Daniel Price, a former maintenance worker with a history of breaking into apartments and living in hidden spaces. Years ago, he had been investigated in connection with a missing woman, but no evidence tied him to the crime. After his arrest, police found disturbing keepsakes in his possession, small personal items from multiple women, suggesting he had been doing this for a long time. When they questioned him about my apartment, he admitted he'd been living there for months, watching me, coming down when I was at work, sometimes standing in my room while I slept. I moved out immediately. To this day, I check every closet, every crawl space, every attic before I sleep. Because I know now, just because you don't see them, doesn't mean they're not there. If you have any scary stories, you can send them to the Gmail address shown on the screen.